Hello. You may or may not know me, but my name is Christian. Thank you for clicking on today's video. Today we are going to be covering a lengthy topic, namely the third Republican presidential candidate debate. In the year leading up to the presidency, multiple debates are held. These debates culminate in a primary election where, this time, the Republican Party will choose their candidate. Furthermore, the Democrat Party will also choose their candidate and put them forward. Both candidates will vow for the position of president, and the public will decide. So, that being said, it is worth noting these people's stances on certain topics, and that is why I'm making today's video. So today we're going to go ahead and jump into that debate. So without further ado, I'm going to address the candidates. In the order that they were introduced, we have Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. To start, each contestant was asked why they would be better than ex-President Donald Trump as the Republican nominee. To start off, they asked DeSantis. DeSantis leads by invoking the common individual by calling into question the elite's concerns for the country. They don't care about your gas prices. They don't care about the open border and its issues. We need leadership. It's not about me. It's about you. It's a very common sentiment. Moving forward, Nikki Haley quotes some debt and poverty statistics, noting that many Americans live paycheck to paycheck and many are below the poverty line. She also cites anti-Semitism, scholastic concerns, and the open borders, as well as the wars going on. She said Trump was the right president at the right time, but no longer is. For now, he's weak at the knees and trying to be friendly again. She says we need to pay down debt. There needs to be transparency within the classroom. We need to secure our borders and have the military at our back. Ramaswamy was third to talk. He says there's something deeper going on here in the Republican Party. He says they are a party of losers. He blames Ronna McDaniel as chairwoman for the losses and incites her to resign publicly. He blames the moderators as well, saying that this should be Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, and Elon Musk. Then we'd have 10 times the viewership, and we'd be asking the right questions. He goes on to allude to the corrupt media, the Trump-Russian scandal, and asks, was that real or some Hillary Clinton made-up story? Answer the question, go. He continues to claim that the media has rigged the elections ever since Trump has been out of office, and his turn was cut short there. After that, Christie came up. He led off by saying, we are dealing with some extraordinarily important issues at this time. Our greatest ally in the Middle East is under fire, wiping every Jewish person off the map. Putin is restarting the Soviet Union. Inflation is choking middle-class families. We are gonna be big, not small. Anyone who is gonna be in and out of the courtrooms for the next year cannot lead the country, in reference to Trump. Finally, Senator Scott leads off with, the truth of my life destroys the lies of the radical left. We need to pull independent voters into our party, winning back Black and Hispanic voters, restoring faith, and our Christian values will help us return to becoming the city on the hill. Founding documents allude to Christian values, and he will be the president that will help us return to a nation of faith and values. From there, they got into the bulk of the arguments, starting off with the conflict in Israel. As many of y'all know, the conflict between Israel and Palestine has gotten hotter and heavier by the day. Hamas continues to relentlessly attack Israel, and Israel is protecting itself currently. It's hard to take a stance unless you're part of the conflict, but these contestants are asked to do so. The moderators asked, "What would you say to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as President of the United States?" DeSantis leads off. He would tell him to finish the job, that Hamas would wipe every Jew off the map if they could. He goes on to say, "I scrambled resources in Florida and got planes over there, the Middle East, to get 700 people back," citing that action is the way, not just talk. After him, Miss Haley goes on and responds, "We need to finish them. Step 1, we need to eliminate Hamas. Step 2, work with Israel. And Step 3, get our hostages back." She goes on to blame Iran for the funding of Hamas and then relates that to where Iran gets their money, ergo China and Russia. She says that Israel is the tip of the spear when it comes to battling Islamic terrorists. From there, Ramaswamy comes on. He goes on to say, "Israel has the right and responsibility to smoke the terrorists at his southern border, and I will smoke the terrorists at our southern borders." He blames Biden for the current state of affairs and then plays identity politics with Haley with his last two statements. She is not asked to respond. Scott goes on to say, "We will stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. Diplomacy is a weak strategy," and said that there was blood dripping from the hands of Obama and Biden for their strategies utilizing such. "We need to strike Iran, cut off the head of the snake. You cannot negotiate with evil, you have to destroy it." From there, Christie is asked to finish the discussion. He says, "We need to provide whatever is necessary to preserve the state of Israel. 1, we need to protect their territory. 2, we need to protect the people of Israel, make sure Hamas can never do this again. And to finally keep their eye on the ball." And to elaborate on this, he said, "Isolate Iran." From there, a couple of candidates were asked to elaborate on their position towards funding of Israel. They only got to DeSantis and Miss Haley. DeSantis would start off by saying, "Yes, if you harm any head on any American, there will be hell to pay." Miss Haley says, "Yes, Iran responds to strength. Attack them and they will respond." From there, another question is asked regarding hate crimes and anti-Semitism within America. Ramaswamy opens up and says that it is a symptom of a deeper cancer, that we need to erase anti-Semitism and wokeism, as he calls it, the practice of being quote-unquote woke, and says that suppression or censorship is not the answer. Rather, we need to embrace these ideologies and talk through them. Mr. Scott then continues the conversation, claims that this behavior is intolerable and would revoke funding if there's any president on any college campus. DeSantis continues and largely agrees with Mr. Scott. He makes no further additional points. Haley concludes this argument and saying, "If the KKK were doing this, every college campus would be up at arms right now. Hamas is against the people." End quote. The next question was about Ukraine. Where do you stand on the funding of Ukraine, was the question posed. They started off with Mr. Scott. He is in support of the funding of Ukraine. He says, "Our interests over there is to degrade the Russian military and erode their strength. So far, it's been effective, but transparency is what is needed. Where's the money going? And who is responsible for all these dollars being funneled into overseas ventures? He then goes on to elaborate that there are quote-unquote sleeper terrorist cells within our borders. Ramaswamy continues the conversation. He says Ukraine is not a paragon of democracy. He then goes on to make a slightly controversial stance on this topic. He lists a multitude of reasons for such, namely that they have banned 11 opposition parties within their country from running. They have consolidated all media into one mega channel and are holding elections hostage for more money from the US and will refuse to do elections until they receive such funding. Furthermore, Ramaswamy goes on to call the Prime Minister a Nazi. I looked this up and it turns out it was inflammatory language referencing a time when the Prime Minister attended a ceremony celebrating a Canadian World War II vet. It turns out that this vet did serve for a partial time under a Nazi platoon. And finally, his last point is that Ukraine has banned the practice of Christianity. Moving on, Haley says that Ukraine is a freedom-loving, pro-American country. She goes on to enlist a sort of Truman Doctrine narrative, stating that Ukraine and eventually Taiwan, along with Israel, will all serve to be major and vital wars in an effort to degrade the strength of China and Russia. This is not unlike an ideology we've seen before during the Cold War. For those of you who don't know, I did gloss over it slightly, but the Truman Doctrine was a set of practices enlisted during the Cold War. The Cold War was named so as we never got into direct conflict with the USSR. We avoided it during the entire event. However, due to the Truman Doctrine, we resisted the spread of communism into other countries, namely Korea and Vietnam. Without the Truman Doctrine, neither of these conflicts would have occurred. Christie is on next. He enlists a similar ideology, stating, "Last time we turned our back on gunfire in Europe, it bought us 3 years, and then Hitler killed 500,000 Americans. This is the price we pay for being leaders of the free world. Don't give in to dictators." He takes a very strong stance. DeSantis ends this discussion by saying he's not sending any troops to Ukraine. He wants to increase the control of the border and deport terrorists home. He then goes on to say that Biden's funds used for the border were actually used to process illegal immigrants into the United States, a goal he says is actually counterproductive. He then invokes Europe to, quote-unquote, pull their weight. The next discussion is about China in relation to military or potential military conflict. The question, as posed, is our current military and naval capacity sufficient enough to deter or, if necessary, defeat China's military? Ms. Haley leads the conversation, stating America needs to modernize our military, listing off a multitude of reasons, starting with 1, no more sales to China, 2, end all formal trade relations until the fentanyl influx is addressed, and 3, strengthen our military and arm Taiwan, for she says an armed and protected Taiwan is the thing that China fears the most. DeSantis continues the conversation, saying, it is not enough. He plays into the fear of China being the global superpower, the fact that they could impose a social credit system or invade every sense of the word of privacy. He compares the Soviet Union to modern-day China and Russia, going back to that Truman Black Doctorate mentality. Mr. Scott continues the conversation. We do not have the financial structures to facilitate the growth we need. The long-term threat is China, but the short-term threat is definitely our southern border. The military efforts need to increase, but our industrial spending will need to accommodate that influx as well. He then references Made in America strategy that would bring jobs back, much similar to a promise Trump made. Ramaswamy then continues the conversation, says we need to increase naval capacity by 20%, build our industrial systems up. We can't unless we remove our dependence from China on electronics. And he also wants to hold China accountable for the COVID-19 virus. In other forms of media, he's proposed plans on how he would do this. Hi, Editing Christian here. I decided to include his plan as it is relevant to the question. So, Ramaswamy unveiled his policy during a speech in New Albany, Ohio, where he presented a comprehensive 4-point plan. One of Ramaswamy's key strategies is to remove the U.S. pharmaceutical dependence on China by fostering stronger trade relations with India and Israel. Another important aspect of Ramaswamy's plan is to involve India, Brazil, and Chile in securing rare earth material imports, such as lithium, which are essential for semiconductors. Ramaswamy has also dismissed climate change as a hoax, suggesting the agenda is designed to allow China to catch up to the US economically. Finally, Ramaswamy's policy includes plans to end the US military's reliance on China for strategic materials and limit foreign entanglements. Back to the regular broadcast. Christie ends that conversation by saying we need to increase the production of nuclear submarines, as they are the thing that is going to win us any potential conflict. They're stealthy, hard to see, and deadly ineffective. Second is the ships. Everyone's favorite social media app, TikTok, is then called into question as being Chinese spyware. The question is, do you think TikTok is spyware and or is bad for America? And do you think it should be banned? Christie starts off the conversation by saying yes, it is polluting the minds of American young people. Furthermore, he states that China is trying to divide America, using the fact that American social media is not in China. He uses this point to drive home the fact that China has a facet into American society, yet we have no facet into theirs. DeSantis continues, saying that yes, he would ban it. It is very effective at infiltrating American society, and he is concerned about the data that China is getting from young people. During Miss Haley's turn, she uses it to go back to prior callouts and defend herself, and unfortunately, nothing about her position on TikTok is stated. Ramaswamy then continues, saying he would ban any company that turns over data to China. It is also worthwhile noting that he, during his turn, called into question Miss Haley's daughter's use of TikTok. Scott finishes his conversation stating that he would enforce parental permission for online apps, stating that he would eliminate TikTok and stop China from buying farmland and stealing American intellectual property. The conversation then shifts to our own economy. The question is, what would you do immediately to manage American household costs? Scott leads the conversation, saying he would open up the XL pipeline. When asked to elaborate as to what he would do immediately, he says that is his immediate action, that this would have an immediate impact as it would increase Americans' trust in our economy and furthermore increase their likelihood to invest. DeSantis continues, he would initially remove Bidenomics and rein in the Federal Reserve. A lot of his conversation is about the use of non-renewable energies as well as renewable energies that we have here within America. Ramaswamy continues, saying that we need to increase the supply of everything: drilling, fracking, coal, and to trust nuclear energy. We furthermore need to increase the supply of housing by way of zoning laws. He states that there are zoning laws that would prevent the reduction of house prices in many areas. Christie continues, stating that energy is the key to this, and to expand on our energy production would benefit every facet of America. Haley finishes up the conversation by saying we need to beef up the middle class, cut taxes on the middle class, and go after the tons of COVID fraud that there is. Next is a conversation about Social Security. Social Security is the elephant in the room. It's the trash fire that we threw in the closet and is slowly burning down our house. It needs to be dealt with. And so, the moderators asked the candidates, would you raise the retirement age? And what other forms of reform would you make? Christie starts off by saying he would raise the retirement age only by a couple of years for people 35-ish and below. He states that only 3 things can change. 1, our taxation levels. 2, the eligibility for these programs. And 3, the age of access. He elaborates on 2 a little bit by saying that the wealthy should not receive benefits. Haley continues the conversation. She will go for entitlement reform, change cost of living increases to inflation increases, and would raise the age for people in their 20s and lower. Ramaswamy says that this is the last window of opportunity. Plans to cut military spending, lay off tons of government employees, and reform American budgeting, going to a zero-based budgeting. Current budgeting schemes are based off of last year's numbers. Zero budgeting throws that away and starts with 0, asking the question, what do we need? Mr. Scott continues the conversation by saying we need to grow our economy, cut our spending. He would not raise the retirement age and references his economic plan. He would cut taxes, referencing the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is a theory hypothesizing the theoretical midpoint where taxation provides the most revenue. Some Laffer curves are drawn showing that lower levels of taxation results in significantly higher revenue. This can be due to a multitude of factors regarding Americans' ability to save or invest with that money. DeSantis finishes this conversation by saying he will not raise the age. He wants to reduce inflation, as inflation negatively hurts seniors disproportionately. He aims to achieve 3% GDP growth and would like to reduce interdepartmental debt. This is something that we don't hear talked about very often, so I will elaborate on that a little bit. Social Security was initially a very well-performing program. There were enough workers to pay off the old people, and the old people died fast enough. That's how it worked. Now, there's not enough workers, and the old people aren't dying fast enough. But back in the day when things were good, the government would take that surplus and use it somewhere else, enlisting an IOU. This is what we call interdepartmental debt. Thank you, government. He cites his hesitancy to raise the age of benefits because the American life expectancy is decreasing. One of the final topics was the border crisis. Over 2 million people crossed illegally last year. Opioids, specifically fentanyl, is a danger. What can you do to stop the flow of fentanyl? Senator Scott opens up the discussion by saying we need to close our southern border. For $10 billion, we can achieve this, and for another $5 billion, we can monitor it. From there, we need to deal with overdosing and human trafficking. It seems his plan allocates at least $15 billion to the defense of our southern border. Christie continues the conversation, saying we need to invest in the law enforcement in that area and send the National Guard to support them. He calls this invasion a disease and hopes to lower the amounts of drug addiction within America. DeSantis continues the conversation, stating that he would declare a national emergency on day one and send troops to the border to, quote-unquote, stop this invasion cold. He would build the wall and have Mexico pay for it. How? He would pose fees on remittances that are being sent to families in foreign countries. This would raise the money necessary, he states. For those who don't know, remittances are the monetary donations that families here in the States send back to families that they have in other countries. This is done because the American dollar is quite wealthy in other parts of the world. He would then declare the drug cartels a terrorist organization and would, quote-unquote, shoot them stone cold dead, end quote. Haley goes on to say she would go straight to the source. She would end all trade relations with Mexico until there is some form of accountability. Then she would enlist special ops into Mexico to hunt the cartels. She would defund sanctuary states and use that funding for mental health and addiction centers. Ramaswamy finishes this conversation by saying it is not an overdose when someone uses this fentanyl. It is a poisoning. These things are laced. You would not call it an overdose if someone put a large amount of fentanyl in your Big Mac. You would call it poisoning. He says, thusly, this warrants a higher level of response. He calls it bioterrorism. He then goes on to commend himself for being the only one talking about the northern border. For reference, there has been some fentanyl confiscated on the northern border and is enough to kill quite a substantial amount of Americans. This, however, pales in comparison to the amount on the southern border and is 1/100th of the amount. The last discussion is of abortion. The question is, as posed, how do you see the path forward for Republicans on this issue? DeSantis starts off by saying every life matters and is pro-life, but only goes so far as to elaborate that abortion at birth is wrong. He refuses to give any hard limit. Miss Haley continues, saying she is pro-life but is in favor of states' rights to choose their own laws. She would support anything that passes because it would save more babies. She would like to work in the middle ground, namely by instituting better adoption systems, better birth control systems, and to stop judgment on both sides of the aisle. Scott is firm in his 15-week national limit, citing that most of America agrees, as well as most of Europe agrees, that a 15-week national limit is ethical. Ramaswamy says nothing new and is pro-life. He instead invokes a parable in which a pregnant woman is walking down the street when a man mugs her. He punches her in the stomach and is solely responsible for the miscarriage of her child. In most courts of law, that would be considered murder. My apologies. Christie actually finishes the conversation by stating it is a state's right to choose. He is pro-life and states we should be pro-life for the entire life. Drug addiction reform and life needs for all that need it. Their closing statements are as follows. Senator Scott states that there is a growing spiritual and cultural crisis, that we need a renewal that we need to reject left faithlessness and fatherless society. We need to return to patriotism. We need to forget victimhood and praise victory. And lastly, he leaves us with a final statement. If you are a man, you should play sports against a man. After the audience has calmed down, Christie continues by saying it is a gift to be an American. She is tired of the division and wants a return to honesty and integrity within the Oval Office. Ramaswamy continues, saying we are in a war between those who love America and a fringe minority that seeks to destroy it. He uses his age and lack of weakness as his reason for ability to tackle on this fringe minority. Haley uses her final words to say the world is on fire. We have wars, and it is very important to know how to protect ourselves. We need to go back to the soul of America, and we can't do that with old politicians. DeSantis is the last one to speak, stating, I will take the hits, arrows, and barbs. It's not about me, it's about you. I will lead this country's revival and will ensure we leave it in better shape for the next generation. Thank you so much for listening. I know this was pretty lengthy and maybe a couple topics were not explained very well. I do apologize. These people are running for public office, specifically the president, so their political knowledge of policy is a little bit more above layman. So I apologize if I did not explain it properly. I do hope that you enjoyed it though, and I hope that you join me again. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This was Christian. Deuces.